everybody, my name is the Author01, and on this channel we talk about Fire Country. Usually we talk about it retrospectively, when there's been lots of time and I've watched the episodes over and over again, to the point where I can envision scenes in my mind. However, my friends asked me to go over the Zabel Ridge Fire, which I did last week. I was going to go through all of the potential suspects in that video. However, I realized the video was already the length of a normal video, so I decided I needed to make a separate video on the suspects. As a result, this video won't be going over the evidence in regards to the Zabel Ridge Fire. You're gonna have to watch my last video to get that, and I'll put it in the iCards. Instead, I'm going to quickly recap the most important pieces of information, and then I'll get into the suspects. We know the fire started east of Edgewater and was pushed into the town by a wind shift. In addition, we know the fire was started by a person and that ATF tracked the location of the ignition down to a 5-acre stretch. At that location, they found a Smokies lighter and a container of lighter fluid. They have not used the word victim in regards to vents. However, Sharon has a direct line to Agent Ruffin, the lead agent on the case, which suggests that he is considered to be a victim. Ruffin has looked at Bodie and Manny's criminal records, which suggests that Station 42 is being looked at. Finally, while Brett tells Sharon that Zabel Ridge is being considered arson, Agent Ruffin is very careful to say human-caused. And that phrasing is important. Okay, time to get into my quick disclaimer that I give anytime I talk about something that requires a license to do as a job. I am not a lawyer. I was a crime journalist, and as a result, I know how to read the laws. Do not consider my statements to be actual statements as to what the law means. These are very much a layperson's reading, and if Legal Eagle for some reason ever makes a video about this, it will be much better and it will be substantially more correct. Alright, now that I've gotten that out of the way, while we use the term arson often to mean human-caused fire, that's not actually what arson means. Arson is the intentional setting of a fire for a malicious purpose. Think setting a home on fire to hurt someone or to get insurance money. As I discussed in my Zabel Ridge video, it is very unlikely that Zabel Ridge was an arson, at least not an arson targeting Edgewater. The fire had to grow substantially and be pushed around by the wind to even hit the town. However, there are still two other categories of human-caused fires that we need to talk about: reckless burning and negligence. In both reckless burning and negligence, the fire, or at least the damage done, was not intended, but the actions around the fire were risky. With recklessness, the person must have known there was a substantial risk of causing fire or the fire getting out of hand. For negligence, the fire was caused by a lack of reasonable care. A fire can also be a pure accident, meaning it wasn't enhanced by unreasonable personal conduct. Now that we understand that human-caused fire and arson are not the same thing, I think it's time that we get into our suspect list. I seriously considered putting these suspects in alphabetical order, but it felt a bit too chaotic. Instead, I've sorted all of our suspects into 4 categories: ruled out, unlikely, weak but thematic, and actual suspects. Normally, when we talk about crime mysteries, we talk about motive, means, and opportunity. However, since half the people on this list are not main characters, and we have a 2-week time skip, I had to come up with other criteria. So I decided to look at 2 criteria for who could have done this. Who had the knowledge to know that you should not start a fire on the west side of Edgewater, and who had access to a Smokies lighter. As a substitute for motive, I decided to look at behavior, specifically behavior after the fire. Starting with the rule out category, the 2 people who I think absolutely could not have done it are Sharon and Eve. It's really simple. They were very personally impacted by the outcome and feel guilty for what they did or didn't do. Eve's entire plotline in the first arc of Season 4, which I'm going to call the Vince is Dead arc, is trying to rebuild Three Rock. Whether it's masterminding a scheme to get the inmates to pay for their housing or swearing to Sharon she won't stop until she gets her guys back, Eve has a singular focus, and if she caused the fire, we wouldn't be here. Likewise, it feels almost redundant to explain that if Sharon had caused this fire, she would have immediately turned herself in. You could almost argue that she kept the station suspended for 8 weeks because she was trying to bait Cal Fire into firing her over Vince's death. The next to rule out here are Bodhi and Gabs. Bodhi's entire life trajectory changes the second he finds out that Zabel Ridge was human-caused. When he finds the lighter fluid, he is quick to call it an accelerant, so I think if Bodhi caused this, we would know. Gabriella is actually the easiest of this quad to rule out. In the season 1 episode A Cry for Help, she was absolutely disgusted with the idea that Jake may have been the arsonist. More recently, in Eyes and Ears Everywhere, she is horrified with the idea that Finn lit his house on fire to draw her to him. This is not how someone who would light an arson acts. There's one more subset of people for whom it is impossible for them to be guilty of Zabel Ridge, and that's the people who could not have gone out to Zabel Ridge. First off the bat is Luke, because he's in Japan. It also seems unlikely that it was Walter, because he is in the nursing home for at least 1 month, most likely 2. The final easy knockout here are the 3 Rock inmates. Yes, Bodhi sneaks out of 3 Rock multiple times, but these are just over to Black Creek, which is explicitly stated to be up the road. Since this fire wasn't originally threatening 3 Rock, it's pretty much impossible for an inmate to have done this. Now that we've gotten through all of the ruled out suspects, we can actually start on the fun stuff. Me going through a whole bunch of potential suspects and telling you what makes them likely and what makes them unlikely. Some of this involved wild creativity, and I hope you guys have as much fun listening to this part of the video as I had writing it. We're moving into the category that I call unlikely. These are people who I don't have a definitive reason to rule out, but they don't reasonably have access to a smokies lighter or firefighting knowledge, or their behavior could be read as sus, or it doesn't seem like they have a very good reason. In addition, since Fire Country is fictional, I did take into account that most of these don't have a good thematic reason for them to be guilty. First on this list is Tyler. Frankly, I would have put Tyler in the no category if not for the fact that there are just so many people who think that it could be Tyler. Let's take a look at why he's not actually a strong contender, though. Fresh Start makes it clear Tyler believes Landon ruined everything and burned down their house, which means there's no room in Tyler's mind for the fire to have been anything other than intentional arson. Likewise, I'm not entirely sure how a 16-year-old, because yes, his driver's license says he was 16 at the time of the fire, would have access to a metal can of lighter fluid when those haven't existed in over a decade. How he would have access to a smokies lighter is so convoluted, I didn't even try thinking of possibilities. This would be a very young people suck option, but it's also one that basically asks us to ignore all of the evidence the show has given us. Next up on the unlikely list is actually a pair, and that would be a random community member or a random fire victim. Bodhi does toss out the possibility of Vince being blackmailed by someone whose house burned down, but I think Jake was right to swat that down. While we do get a multitude of community members throughout the show, I think it's highly unlikely they're going to go, hey, remember this guy from 2 Pink Lines? Actually, he was the one who started the fire. While we're talking about random community members, I suppose I may as well throw the Barlow family on this list. On the one hand, this is a family of anti-government extremists that live east of Edgewater and hate all government, not just bureaucrats. They are also currently shooting up the sheriff's office. However, they have enough fertilizer to blow up half of Edgewater, and since this family is clearly intended to represent Waco or those Texas ranchers that were grazing their cattle on federal lands, I feel like if they were going to set Edgewater on fire, they would do a better job and immediately take responsibility. The last 2 that I've put on this list would be Ruby and Renee. Renee is very upset that Vince is dead in the episode The Tiny Ways We Start to Heal. I suppose it's possible she could have had a smokies lighter from when she was a teenager, or been given one by Sharon as a gift. I also think her promise as a red herring has yet to be fulfilled, but her as the fire starter is very unsatisfying to me. I feel the same way with Ruby. There is very little keying into her as a potential suspect. I know how she would get the lighter. I just don't know why she would plant the lighter if she started the fire, and having her start the fire would just reinforce how terrible she was, which I think is kind of intended to be the opposite of the point of her little mini arc with Sharon. This next category I'm going to call weak evidence. I don't necessarily think that there's more evidence that the people in this category did it than the people in the unlikely category. That being said, I do think that for some of them, there is strong thematic reason that these people could have done it, and I would be more accepting of one of these people being the person who did it, even if it wasn't seeded, than I would be from the former list. This combination of plausible access and definitive thematic purpose makes sense when you consider the first person on the list, Manny. When it comes to access, I think it's fair to say that he could have gotten a lighter from Vince or Sharon, or otherwise picked one up around Smokey's. On the knowledge side, he is a firefighter and he worked for Vince, so he would understand the danger of setting a fire on the west side of Edgewater. Also, Zabel Ridge is started between two highways, and we know that in No Good Deed, he starts a fire, claiming that there's no way it could get out of control because the road will act as a natural line. On a thematic sense, he works exceptionally well, perhaps the best on this list. As I said in my Sharon video, Manny is a huge benefactor of the Leones doing things that are, let's say, not above board. We could pull that even further into seasons 2 through 4. Vince rehires him after the Three Rock scandal, Luke gets him off after a fight in It's Not Over, and Sharon encourages him to apply for Jake's job. That being said, I don't think that any of this evidence is strong enough to consider him a suspect, and this some evidence, not enough evidence dovetails very nicely into my next not a suspect, but the evidence is kind of there, which is Finn, Gabriella's stalker in the last arc of season 3, which I call the Exalta arc. I think Finn is a decent suspect. We know he committed arson in Eyes and Ears Everywhere to draw Gabriella to him. While 42 is there, he fakes a back injury to get an opportunity to be alone with Gabs. He pulls a scalpel on her, and only escapes capture because he manages to clunk Vince on the head with an ambulance door when Vince is about to save her. At the top of A Change in the Wind, we do see him camped outside Station 42, not long after Sharon announces the Zabel Ridge Fire, which could suggest he planned to stalk the engines and kidnap her out on the fire. A problem, though, is that this fire wasn't lit in 42's jurisdiction. They're third on the scene, and we know that he is hanging out with 42 enough to be cleared to go on the rescue in Fire and Ice. So I would assume he has a rough idea of what their territory is. We also don't know how he would have had access to a Smokey's lighter or why he would leave it behind. If Finn was the person who started the fire, I don't think it would have been accidental, so it's hard to imagine that the lighter would have been left behind on accident. The biggest problem with Finn, though, is that they do a pretty quick job of dispatching him from the narrative. They decided that he was insane or perhaps mentally incompetent and ship him off to a state hospital. I have a lot of problems with how they do this, but I'm going to have to get into that when I do my season 3 essay series. I just feel like if they wanted him to stay a suspect, why would they ship him off without any fanfare? These next two on the list are groups, and I actually think they have a lot of potential. The problem, though, is that they require speculation and a level of paying attention to the series that I'll admit that nobody other than me is probably doing, and I'm only doing it because I make these YouTube videos. The first person on this list is a friend or family member of an inmate at 3 Rock. I think this could be an interesting answer. The problem with this solution, though, is that it requires remembering a bunch of tiny details from across the seasons. While I love that the show rewards close viewing and rewatching, I think this feels just a little too much like making the pieces fit and not nearly enough like intentionally placed clues. The theory would go something like this. In the episode Welcome to the Cult, one of the 3 Rock inmates stole one of the Smokies lighters to keep as a souvenir. However, they were angered by the events of the Exalta arc since Sharon Steele only got money for Birch's family and the camp itself. Manny got released, but the other inmates got nothing. An inmate could have gotten a family member or associate to plant both the lighter fluid and the Smokies lighter after starting the fire as a way to harm Sharon. Every step in this theory has something in the show to back it up. We know from the episode Affair to Remember that inmates sometimes steal things on community projects, though usually it's like cigarettes or beer. Passing things between inmate and visitor is how sleepers smuggle drugs into 3 Rock. Hiding contraband is also common. After all, we see multiple inmates, including Big Mike, Bodie, and Cole, have cell phones. Actually, Big Mike has 2 cell phones in Season 1 alone. One that gets confiscated in Happy to Help, and one in My Kinda Leader. None of these clues feel like things that will just pop out on rewatch. There's enough there, but it just doesn't feel satisfying as much as it feels like something that you put together at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep. My last group, and the one that I think is the most interesting, would be a background firefighter at Station 42. I don't mean some random firefighter that we've never seen before. I specifically mean one of the handful of firefighters that have names and are recurring presence. I don't think we're going to have any brand new characters added, especially since they've given us so many background firefighters to begin with. It would be easy to slot one of them into this role. Oh, you didn't know that there were other named characters at Station 42. Very fair. If this is your first video of mine, you may not know this, but I'm currently working on a series where I lay out all the appearances of these named firefighter extras in Fire Country. These characters don't have any plot development, but they're part of the texture of the station. Specifically, I would say Arthur, Molly, Maddie, and Eddie are the ones with names that I'm tracking across Season 4. Personally, the only one that I could see any specific in-universe evidence for beyond just that they exist is Eddie. Bodie accuses Jeff Brannick of starting the fire because he quit Smokies a few days after Vince died, and we haven't seen Eddie since I'd Do It Again. There's also another character named Bubba that I've only seen in 2 episodes, but I didn't spot him in the scavenger hunt I did for Season 4 either. If they want Bodie's line to be something more than insistence that he can find the answer, it would make sense to pick one of them. And now, because I talk to people in my real life, I know that you are probably saying, Author, how is it possible that these are all of the people in your weak suspect pool? We still have 2 main characters in our cast to go. And yeah, we do. But we should probably first get into Landon, because he's definitely the guy that the show is trying to distract us into thinking is guilty. Landon is intriguing to me because if we had gone on our mid-season hiatus after episode 8 like usual instead of episode 9, I would probably put him in either the unlikely or weak evidence category. I understand Tyler thinks he's guilty, but Tyler is also a traumatized teenager. I do believe Tyler is reacting to strong evidence, but it feels pretty unlikely that this random dude has a Smokies lighter and used it completely independently of the fire chiefs who own the bar. Plus, if Landon intended to commit arson against the community of Edgewater, why would he light the fire on the other side of a major highway? I know that Bodie hates Landon a lot, but if you think about it, sometimes it feels like Bodie is projecting his negative feelings about Vince onto Landon. But we didn't go on hiatus after episode 8 this time, and that's the episode where Landon acts incredibly suspicious. He shows up at the fire station and threatens Sharon. He doesn't threaten bodily harm, but he says people who don't know shouldn't ask questions. I still think that it's highly unlikely Landon lit the blaze, but he does seem to know who did. We also know he was questioned by the ATF, but didn't hand over his tip about who the true arsonist is, which is interesting, but it's a little early to say why it's interesting. Continuing on down the line, we have Jake. I'm not gonna lie, Jake has a lot of thematic significance as well as theoretical access to means. I'm going to start with the hard evidence, then we'll circle back to the thematic stuff. Well, Jake does not have definitive access to a Smokey's lighter. I'd say Jake has slightly more probability of having access to a Smokey's lighter than anyone on the weak list, including Manny. He could have taken one when he was younger if he worked at Smokey's. He could have been given one by Vince, Sharon, or Bodie after they bought the bar. He obviously has firefighter knowledge, and since he was kind of trailing after Vince for many years, he would pretty obviously know that it was a bad idea to start a fire west of Edgewater. Moving on to the thematic evidence, the beginning of Jake's life as one of the unofficial Leone kids started with an arson. He lit his bedroom on fire to keep his dad Bobby from divorcing his mom Lily. Vince and Sharon covered it up, and at some point, Jake became best friends with Bodie. When Jake is accused of serial arson by Erica 18 years later, Vince is very uncertain that Jake is innocent, but he seems to be planning to go along with Sharon's plans to protect Jake. The show also lampshades the idea that the arsonist could be Jake several times. In Eyes and Ears Everywhere, Eve tells Jake to stop lighting fires in the metaphorical sense to get Vince's attention. In Goodbye for Now, he claims Vince would have fired Bodie after having a mental health breakdown at the scene, but Vince had a mental health breakdown the night Riley died, so it seems more like Jake projecting a desire to be Vince's true heir. Later in the episode, he says Vince's death was Bodie's fault for not following orders. In Not Astray, he gets very touchy when Brett reminds him that he screwed up at Buena Vista, and in The Tiny Ways He Starts to Heal, he doesn't even remember that it's Vince's birthday. All of these things together could be more about how Jake isn't actually as close to them as he likes to believe, an idea he endorses in the Leone way. However, it could still be a sign that Jake knows more than he's saying. I don't think the fire was intended to harm Edgewater, and I think whatever Jake may have done, it could have been an accident. It makes sense that Jake could be blunting off emotion as a way to deal with the fact that he killed someone he really cared about. Okay, I suppose it's time to get to the reason why all of you are here, also to maybe cause the biggest amount of drama that the Fire Country fandom has ever seen. The last person on this list is Vince. I recognize that it's pretty hard to imagine Mr. told Kara's mom to redo the old wiring in their house a million times, lighting a fire that destroyed Edgewater, but bear with me. The thing about Vince is that he's the only one on this list who we know for a fact had access to a Smokey's lighter, and has the firefighting knowledge to start a fire on the east side of town between two highways. The geography of the fires suggests that it was something that got out of hand. From this point, we could reason the Smokey's lighter and the container of lighter fluid were not planted to make a scene, but left during a hasty escape. Behavior-wise, we see Vince very stressed out throughout the fire, including yelling at Bodie that he and Walter are not allowed to re-enter the nursing home. Later, Vince goes back to save Walter, even though it was risking 2 additional lives to save one person who was in a dementia episode and could have been combative if found. Vince gets incredibly upset when Walter starts panicking about death and yells at him that they're not dying. Like with Jake, this could be evidence that Vince doesn't want to be responsible for killing his father, or it could just be normal stress for the fact that a community-destroying fire is taking place and his father and son are putting their lives in danger. I did play around with different motives that Vince could have. Initially, I did think that maybe Vince could have started the fire to show Jake that he is a valued member of 42. It seems weird that Vince would wait until Jake's last day. The idea that he may have burned something and it got out of hand fits a lot better. However, Vince as the fire starter doesn't give us a big, satisfying conclusion of being able to point to someone and say, they killed Vince. In addition, I can't think of something more likely to detonate this already fragile fandom than making Vince guilty of starting the fire. I mean, Screen Rant is already making articles about Sheriff Country showing up Fire Country. My defense of Vince aside, it seems interesting to me that he is the only one who absolutely has the means and doesn't have a definitive no behind him. I think this would be an interesting storyline, and we've already been told by Tia that this season is all about Vince, even if the guy is dead. It's gonna be a while before I talk about season 3, but lately I've been frustrated with how everybody gets to just pretend like their behavior towards Vince in season 3 didn't happen. A storyline like this might force them to re-examine the last year of his life. Admittedly, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there is another suspect somewhere. However, this list was everyone that me, my mom, and the members of Fire Country Book Club could think of as potential suspects for the Zabel Ridge arson. Per usual, I tried to do this in as scientific a fashion as I could manage. However, if this is truly going to be done in a data analytics manner, that means that I need to talk about the limitations of my analysis. These are the things that could not have been taken into account when I was working on this analysis of who could or could not be guilty. I've already talked about the fact that we have a 2-week time gap between Jake quitting and his last day, but there are 2 more limitations that I need to go over. First, the smoky slider. Admittedly, it would be weird for someone to start a fire with a Smokies lighter and not have it be targeting Vince or Sharon. They are prominent public figures, and the season 3 episode, Edgewater is About to Get Real Cozy, made it clear people in this town had a lot of opinions about Vince and Sharon buying the bar. We don't know how long those lighters existed, so I'll say it's possible that a lighter walked away during the many years they've been in existence, not specifically during Vince and Sharon's ownership. We know from Sheriff Country that the meetup is where teenagers get their first service industry jobs. In Your Voice in My Head, Bodhi says most of the people that work at Smokies are transient, staying only a couple of months at a time, which does seem to line up with the culture of deadwater growers. The other vital limitation to talk about is the existence of zombie fires and root fires. Root fires are something that we've known about since the pilot, where Manny yells at Freddy for not digging up a root. Freddy says it's underground, and Manny explains that fire can travel underground. We have seen this twice before. Once in the season 1 episode Watch Your Step, where they fight fire at a wellness retreat, and again in the season 3 doubleheader, Promise Me and Coming in Hot, where Sharon recognizes the smoke as being caused by zombie fires. Because I'm me, this is probably the part where you expect me to dig up the science behind zombie fires and extrapolate out the most likely period of time when this would have happened. However, this show literally made up the concept of fire tornadoes to be able to kill Kara and create a Wizard of Oz reference. On the other hand, they did do a very meticulous job of showing us that this fire was not intentional, or if it was intentional, it was not intentional to burn down Edgewater. So, it is possible, but this really only brings in Walter and Luke as possibilities. It doesn't explain, though, why the Smokies lighter and the lighter fluid ended up right where they attract the point of ignition to. As I close out this video, I really want to emphasize that I don't think Fire Country is pulling some sort of monk-style gotcha, where they are like, here's a videotape and it says that Vince actually knew who started the fire all along. Unless the person who started the fire is Jake, of course. It feels like a story with intentionally placed clues, and while at times it feels more like Psych seeding all 6 potential endings to their episode 100 clues, I think that the show wants us to guess. More importantly, I think that they want us to be able to rewatch and see the clues that they were seeding in season 4 and potentially season 3. Speaking of rewatches, I suppose it's officially time we return to our regularly scheduled programming. And by regularly scheduled programming, I of course mean getting back to our season 1 essay series. I know Fire Country doesn't come back until the end of February. However, we will be starting with our first video back, one about Gabriella, on February 21st. It was a lot of fun to talk about Edgewater's Golden Girl in both her video and in Manny's video, which comes back the week after. I plan to post weekly again starting on the 21st, with a targeted date of the final episode in my series coming out on May 23rd. When I originally did the math for this, my season finale was supposed to be 1 week after the Fire Country season finale. But I had not been banking on them doing an episode on December 19th, which derailed the Christmas video. So, we'll see, but I am limited in that I can only put these videos out once per week. So, all right. Bye, guys.